All right.
All right. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a second workshop where we're focusing on cooperative principles. We're diving in to this delicious food for thought, and we just appreciate your time and your energy as we essentially try to discuss and explore and deepen our own expertise on principled cooperation. So let's begin. Today, we're going to be discussing principles 3 and 4, member economic participation and autonomy and independence. And we'll be exploring this in a variety of ways, but our main objectives are to help you understand why these two principles are important. Why is it important that members economically participate in their groups? And why is it important that we strive to retain autonomy and independence as core principles to cooperation? We'll also try to convey a few best practices to make member economic participation more meaningful and a few risks that one might engage or identify and try to engage when it comes to making agreements with other organizations. So before we move on, a brief introduction. My name is Johan Matthews. I'm a community engagement facilitator here at the Cooperative Fund of New England. And so I'm working with emerging communities to provide coaching and connections to help us get to the next level in terms of starting cooperative enterprise throughout, different regions who haven't been able to. So I'll allow my colleague to introduce herself as well.
And I'm Carolyn Edslevetter. I'm the Cooperative Business Support Officer and working both on direct support to individual co-ops to, grow, form, develop, and also developing partnerships so that we can develop a more supportive ecosystem. A little bit about Cooperative Fund of New England. We are a community development loan fund. We've been around for about 45 years. And our vision is to create economic justice for all through thriving cooperative enterprises. And we primarily do that by providing financial products at reasonable rates. In the past, mostly that's been debt. We're looking at also some equity and grant options as part of our new strategic plan. Providing business coaching, connections, and training, and offering a socially responsible investment opportunity to people within our ecosystem. Just to give a little background, so we've been focusing on co-op principles throughout this year, and where do these come from? So these come from the International Cooperative Alliance, which has been around since the 1800s, and I think we really want to kind of situate this and recognize that cooperation's been happening for as long as human beings have been forming communities. So this is not something that the Brits thought up, 100 and something years ago. And in fact, it's really deeply embedded in communities and cultures around the world. So, in particular, this series we've been looking back at the principles that African Americans in the U.S.
Kwanzaa and
I just lost my train of thought. The Cooperative Principles that are referred to in Kwanzaa, but also just to sort of recognize that these are principles that are found throughout. And at the end of this presentation, which everybody who's registered will get a copy of the presentation, there's a link to the ICA's sort of guidance document, which is like some really deep exploration of the principles as they've established them and revised them over the years, again, with reference to what's going on at the international scale with co-ops, because, co-ops look really different from one country to the next. So if you want some engaging and interesting reading, that is there for your enjoyment.
And this series that we're doing when we're diving into these principles, we're kind of starting from the bottom for folks who may not have been familiar or have an experience or even have geeked out as much as we have in regard to cooperative principles. So we start at the beginning. What is a cooperative? And so we're defining or running with the definition of a cooperative as an autonomous association of persons or people united voluntarily to meet their common needs through jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise, right? So the name of this workshop is For Us, By Us. I feel like that encompasses exactly what we're trying to convey here. It's an enterprise for people, and it's run by those people, and it provides services that those people need. So, you know, that's what's really interesting to me about cooperatives as a people development engine, as an enterprise that puts people at the center of it. So we've been exploring cooperative principles. As I mentioned, this is the second workshop. And the first workshop, we touched on voluntary and open membership and democratic member control. And again, I feel like the topic of the title of this workshop really speaks to that, you know, voluntary and open membership for us, right? Who is this enterprise for? And how do we operate that enterprise in a way that is non-discriminatory? And how do we engage discernment when we're trying to engage or become a member of a cooperative? You know, how do we know if it's for us? And then democratic member control by us, right? How do we engage the processes that unite and coordinate multiple perspectives to allow this thing to work, you know, as smoothly as possible? And today we're looking at members' economic participation and autonomy and independence. So these are the ones we're going to dive in today. So I'll let my colleague take the first one.
Yeah, so the cooperative principle of member economic participation, if you want to just go straight to the next slide, please. The first three quotes here are from that ICA guidance document to sort of situate us. What does this mean, member economic participation? Cooperatives exist to meet the needs of people, not to primarily generate a speculative return on capital invested in them. The primary motive for people forming a cooperative is to be self-reliant. So for us, by us. And it's really about putting the people first rather than capital first. And in a cooperative, capital is in service of people, and labor and people are not in service of capital. And this is really like referenced back to in, so when Tanzania was formed, the first president there, Julius Nyerere, said, "The creation of wealth is a good thing. It will cease to be good the moment wealth ceases to serve humans and begins to be served by humans." So next slide. So it's really getting at the principles of Ujima and Ujamaa. So, you know, collective work and responsibility, and also collective economics, so that we come up with solutions for what's happening in our community, and we work together to solve problems. And, you know, we put resources into a common pot, and we also take resources back out of that common pot. This slide is really just here for your future reference. This is the entire actual third principle. And we're just going to take it a little chunk at a time, but it's really just here as a placeholder for the notes. So the first piece of this is members equitably contribute capital. So usually co-ops accomplish this by having some sort of a buy-in share. And in you know, in a multi-stakeholder corporation, a non-cooperative corporation, you can have, you know, some number of shares, and people get votes based on the number of shares that they hold. In a co-op, you have one member, one share, one vote. So there's this equity that's built into the structure that having more capital to put in does not entitle you to more voice. Yeah, as a person, your voice is equally as important as every other person in the co-op. Now, who decides what capital gets put in? That's usually established by the founding members, and the bylaws will say in what form that can be changed, whether it requires a vote of all the members or the board can decide or whatever. And there are sort of a couple of different factors that go into figuring out that member buy-in. One is it may be part of the initial kind of financial plan for the co-op that you actually need X amount of money as equity to be able to leverage other opportunities, other funds to get off the ground. And also it's has to do with who are your members and what do they need and what's going to feel like kind of skin in the game for them, but still be doable. So what, that buy-in can vary hugely, anywhere from like $100 to like $15,000, just depending on, sorry about this emergency vehicle. Just depending on the members of the co-op and sort of what's doable for them and what's attainable for them, and also the industry and what sort of they anticipate the return on that investment is going to be. So, some really high return, high margin industries like, architecture and engineering and stuff may have a higher buy-in than a coffee shop or a print shop, where sort of low barrier to entry and a lot of turnover in co-op members. If you have staff who only stay on for a couple of years at a time, it's very hard to ask them to pony up a few $1,000s. So those are some factors that go into figuring out a buy-in price. And then members democratically control the capital. Mostly what that means is that members work together to decide how to use the surplus. And surplus is kind of a co-op specific term that really means net profit that's generated by the members. So they might do that, all the members together in sort of a direct way, or they might, again, say, we elect our board and our board makes that decision or whatever. But in either case, the co-op has a responsibility to be reporting out on its financial situation and how it's doing to its members on a regular basis, and really making sure that they have the tools to understand what's going on, because they get to decide directly or indirectly how they're going to use any surplus that they generate. At least part of the capital is usually common property of the cooperative. Okay, what does that mean? So it means that even if you have internal capital accounts where individual members might have some of the surplus put aside, there's also some sort of a reserve, whether that's just your working capital is held in common, or when the co-op buys a fixed asset, when it buys a piece of equipment or a truck, that truck doesn't have anybody's name on it. Like, that's everybody's truck. Their shared capital went into buying it. And also, co-ops usually establish some sort of an indivisible reserve just to protect them for the future. Now, this usually word is like right there in the principle, and it's because ultimately every co-op gets to decide, and they want to sort of retain that flexibility and that autonomy for the co-ops to decide what's best. So why might it be important to have some capital held in common? And you can throw that in the chat or just like unmute yourself. Why do we think this is part of the principle?
I guess I don't quite understand. So that implies, and pardon me if I didn't follow what you just presented, but that implies part of the capital is not common property of the cooperative. So I'm not quite following the distinction there.
Well, so, say at the end of the year, the co-op had $30,000 in surplus. The members could decide and say that there are 3 members. The members could decide, hey, we each get to cash out and take $10,000, or we each get to take $10,000 and we're going to keep it in our internal capital account, but use it as a loan back to the co-op, or we're going to take half of that and put it in an indivisible reserve or use it to buy a truck or whatever. There are different ways that they can handle that. Okay, some really smart things happening in the chat. Pulling our resources is part of our power. Members get paid out capital when they leave. That's correct. So it will be, it's anything that's been allocated to them would get tracked and they'd get it when they leave. but they can decide that some of it's going to stay, it's not going to get all allocated. Some of it might stay in the common pot. Collateral for retaining lending dollars, right? So money that stays in the business, you can leverage that as equity to get other capital. Common capital stays in the co-op and adds stability and resilience. Capital for growing the business, right? Yeah. Okay, and then so the other side of this coin, members usually receive, there's that word again, usually, receive limited compensation, if any, on capital subscribed as a condition of membership. So again, like in a traditional business, you might make an investment or, you know, in the investing world in general, you might make an investment and think like, well, I'm assuming that's going to come with a certain % return per year. Certainly if, you know, if a co-op gets member loans as opposed to capital as part of a buy-in, those loans would be set up with some sort of, you know, some sort of rate of return on them. Your buy-in share is really, your main return on investment is the ability to participate in the co-op. So it's that in the case of a co-op grocery, you pay your buy-in share and you get to like shop at the co-op and get member discounts and vote for the board of directors. And, you know, it's not so much that little dividend that you get at the end of the year. That's more of a nice to have. Same with a worker co-op. The money that you pay to buy in as a worker owner is not so you can get rich beyond your wildest dreams. It's so that, again, you get to come to work every day, make decisions with your fellows about how things get done, serve on the board, vote for the board, but mainly like have a safe, dignified place to work where you have a say in what goes on. And again, if you're in the fortunate position that there's something left at the end of the year, awesome. But that's not usually why you're buying into a co-op. And then, okay, the patronage slide. So we're not going to get deep into this because this is the place where you go down the rabbit hole never to emerge. But this sort of shows the flow of what happens to net income at the end of the year and how money flows through a co-op. And again, really just here sort of for your notes to peruse later. But the interesting thing is kind of, okay, what happens at the end? So there's surplus and members democratically get to decide what happens with that. So it might be further developing the co-op. It might be sort of investment in growth, in training for staff, in additional benefits, things like that. It might be investing in a reserve so that there's more stability and sustainability for the co-op. You know, I personally, in a worker co-op that I was part of previously, we had an experience where we had a loss in a given year. And had we not had a reserve, that loss would have been discounted from everybody's individual capital accounts. Luckily, we had a reserve and it was sufficient to offset that. And so we didn't have to take that hit. But, you know, yay for reserves. Surplus can also be used just to benefit members in proportion to how much they have put in, either of, you know, hours worked or in a consumer co-op, dollars spent or product provided or whatever. So that would be a case in which you actually are allocating patronage to the members. And then the last bucket is just supporting other activities that the members might decide are important. So that could be charitable contributions. It could be an investment in forming another co-op. It could be setting up a scholarship fund, you know, where like the sky's the limit. But the really important thing is that, you know, members' participation creates a surplus if you plan well and everything goes in your way, in your favor. And then members get to decide what happens to that surplus based on what they feel best meets their shared goals. Okay, so that was a lot. Questions? comments, bad jokes? And for introverts like me, if you want to put it in the chat, I'll totally read it and answer it.
I guess I guess this is kind of a comment, is like, there's also tax benefits associated with kind of where you put those retained earnings, as I understand it. So as something else for the co-op to be thinking about to, manage the tax impacts to their membership.
Yeah, and there's tax impacts both ways. It's tax impacts on the co-op and on the members. And sometimes there's a balancing act and a conversation to be had there. But yeah, that's exactly right, that understanding all of the implications for everybody. Sometimes there are implications too for people who have additional unexpected income and get public assistance or get any sort of benefits or on any sort of income scaled plans. So again, it's about knowing your members and having a conversation about that. Joshua, I see your hand.
Just kind of a thought or idea in question, because Adam brought up like the tax benefits. What if, like with those retained earnings, everybody elects, hey, let's get everybody a new awesome cell phone, and then that's tax deductible, and everybody, like if retained earnings aren't that much, does that ever happen? Have you heard of something like that?
Yeah, I mean, tax strategies for co-ops are like tax strategies for other businesses, with the additional option of you can pass some of it through to your members. But yeah, I mean, co-ops definitely, could have a strategy that says, let's reduce our taxable income by increasing our expenses.
Thank you.
Okay, let's keep rocking. So, Cooperative Principle 4, Autonomy and Independence. So, what does the principle say? It says that cooperatives are autonomous self-help organizations controlled by their members. It says if they enter into agreements with other organizations, including governments, or raise capital from external sources, they do so in terms that ensure democratic control by their members and maintain their cooperative autonomy. So let's break it down. So we already know that they're autonomous self-help organizations controlled by their members. And I think this is the key part when it comes to autonomy and independence. Just what happens when you enter into agreements with external groups, right? Governments or foundations or banks or investors. That's where your autonomy or your independence might be compromised. And so when you do so in terms that ensure democratic control by your members. How does the members' input come into play? How do we decide what happens to us and maintain their cooperative autonomy, right? How do we ensure that we're self-governing, that we are able to define what we want to see as success and move towards that? And so it's not defined by someone else. And so the question is integrity. How do you retain the integrity of cooperative autonomy? How do you make sure that your organization does not compromise this ability to be autonomous? And one of the quotes in the ICA document talks about the values, because principles are informed by values. And so the three values it references are self-help, self-responsibility, and democracy. So let's talk about them briefly. The first, self-help. And I think this is, sentimented by the idea of, it's no use waiting for governments or those in possession of wealth and power to bring about fundamental change, right? So it puts the impetus of change on you. So starting where you are and what you have. And this is why equity is so important, because equity talks about the essential contribution of every member. Whether they have $1,000, $10,000, whatever it is, everybody who's coming is essential. And so we recognize whatever you have as valuable. Self-responsibility. That's adhering voluntarily to good governance, right? And so that's an alternative to regulation that we see as a challenge in engaging enterprise throughout the broader economy, right? You want to be able to regulate yourself, right? There's a Lil Wayne quote for you. Rules are for who need them. And the idea is simple. right? How do you adopt policies and practices that you know are the right thing to do, right? How do you pay your workers a living wage off the bat without being imposed, without that being imposed? How do you, handle your waste in a way that is regenerative to the environment rather than extractive? How do you engage these triple bottom line ideas of profit? What are you dealing with profit? How do you deal with the social responsibility? And how do you deal with your responsibility to the environment, right? How are you responsible in that way? And cooperatives have an advantage because people are usually tuned into that idea and they're able to do so without waiting for government regulation. And democracy. Democracy, for someone like me who is a fully naturalized American citizen but was born in a different country, can be a dirty word, right? Because America doesn't always set the best example abroad or even at home, right? But we know it's important because cooperation and working with other people is essential to any type of peaceful existence or peaceful enterprise, right? Nonviolent enterprise. And so, I've been thinking and talking about ducks a lot lately in this regard. So, I was telling someone about ducks and democracy. Ducks are good examples of democracy. They work together each year to fly down south. And when they do so, they get in a formation. The leader's out in front of the V. And when that leader gets tired, they switch out and another duck gets in, right? Peaceful transfer of power. When they're in that formation, resistance is reduced and speed is increased. And that isn't happening just because they're ducks. It's happening because they're going in the same direction. And that's what I think is missing oftentimes from what we think of as democracy. And so in a cooperative, people need to come together with their multiple perspectives and benefit from that momentum that's created by moving in formation, but they have to be moving in the right direction or the same direction. So I think, that's a big part that's missing from our conversation here. And I also want to contrast or compare this to the kawaida principle that we know through Kwanzaa as kujichagulia, right? That's to define ourselves, to name ourselves, to create for ourselves, to speak for ourselves. It speaks to self-determination. And this has been particularly important for people who are identified as Black in this country and around the world, right? And so how do we enable self-determination? How do we define and name ourselves? And I think this comes in with understanding how we see problems. Any community, whether these are communities identified as Black or Native American or low income earning, whatever the case is, how do we see the problem and why? And so an example is this food desert versus food apartheid issue, right? For years, USDA designated certain areas as food deserts. A lot of scholars, other people, institutions were talking about these neighborhoods as food deserts. And you go to that neighborhood, people wouldn't have a clue what that meant, right? And recently you see activists say, no, we're not food deserts, we're food apartheid. Now, what's the distinction? When you're a food desert, you're saying there's not resources, there's not cash flowing in that community to afford groceries. But that's not true because those people are paying taxis and buses to get to other communities to get their food. They're paying more money to access the same food. And so food apartheid means an intentional separation based on some characteristics, usually race or some other characteristic that those institutions view as important. Another thing in terms of naming ourselves is the terms that we identify these communities, right? We see BIPOC now in terms of institutions. We saw minority a little bit ago. A couple of decades ago, it was Negro. Who gave these names to these groups of people, right? Was it defined or named by themselves? And so I think that's really important to understand as we engage in this. And so to create for ourselves, the solutions to the problem come from the way we see the problem. In fact, the way you see the problem is the problem. That's something that's espoused by, a few different books. I think Stephen Covey is one of them. And we talk about how can we engage these problems right here, right now with what we have, right? And so the example with the food desert or the food apartheid issue, it was a food desert. We think, okay, let's get a big corporation to come in and create a supermarket, right? They'll hire 5 to 10 people, put them part-time, pay them $12 an hour, success, right? Not exactly, right? Because that solution came out of a way of seeing that community. And so if you reimagine that problem or you see it as food apartheid, meaning intentional decisions made by institutions and businesses, Now you can think of different solutions, right? You can have intentional decisions by farms that are created in that neighborhood or outside of that neighborhood where folks get a share, right? You can create different solutions based on how you see the problem. So I think it's really important for autonomy and for self-determination to understand that how we see the problem is a problem, and the solutions come out of how we see the problem. And lastly, to speak for ourselves, right? Who tells our story? This has been something that we've seen folks getting in trouble or feeling a lot of resistance, trying to tell a community story, right? So how does that community tell its own story? How does it preserve its own history and create its own happy ending? So these are really important principles, values underlying that. And so agreements, that's kind of the crux of this autonomy and independence issue. What agreements do we get into? And the first is going to be with the state, right? The state is endorsing this capitalistic structure, and that's the environment that cooperatives exist in. And so independence from government or the state, that means that the members of the cooperative are free and are liberty to make decisions democratically based on what's in the best interest of their members and their communities. So, not being told what problems you have to solve. Nonprofits face this all the time, right? The funder has these 3 priorities, and so you have to fit into that box. Or businesses who might want to access other things, or cooperatives in this case. You can see a county government thinking cooperatives are really cool. Let's create a cooperative right there, right? We want to solve this problem. And the members of the community never involved. And so there's a lot of hype, but that cooperative isn't sustainable because it wasn't from that community. So we see that a lot, and that's something to be concerned about. And so when it comes to grants and government contracts, you can see people get into agreements where the contracts are awarded for a fixed time period for a year or 3 years. And then after that, you've got to compete against much larger organizations, right? And so, the county says we're going to award this cooperative with the contract for these workers who go to this hospital. And then after that, they've got to compete with Uber and Lyft or taxis or buses or whatever. And then profits start dwindling and there's no support for that organization afterwards. Or the support is just programmatic. It's just to do this one thing and there's no support for the organization itself. And so it's unsustainable because there's no capacity being built over time. They just have enough to run the program, then there's no money, and then another program. And so I call this disabling capacity. It's going back to that whole idea, and this is my idea, but this is an idea that you create capacity in a way that disables the population, right? When it came to that grocery store example, if you want to help a group who's dealing with food insecurity and you bring in an outside institution, a supermarket or whatever it is, you're not actually helping those people increase their capacity. You're bringing in an external source of power or whatever the case is, and teaching them to farm might be an enabling capacity, something that strengthens their ability to deal with food security. So co-ops lean on the enabling side rather than disabling side. And how might we or governments create an enabling environment for cooperatives to get started, to sustain themselves, right? That's some questions that come out of this. And if you got answers, drop them in the chat. I don't have answers to them. So, while too much state control is bad, as I mentioned, no state involvement can be equally unhelpful and short-sighted because we're still in this context. We want government to put forth policies that are friendly to cooperatives, that make sense for them. A lot of work has been done to evolve the legal structure so that cooperatives can do the things we do today, in patronage and the tax treatments and those types of things. So it's definitely unhelpful to not be involved with the state, as unhelpful as it might be to become involved in some of these issues. And so let's talk about capital sources, right? Lenders and non-member investors. So too much reliance can lead to a loss of autonomy, right? You can get a loan or an investment and you lose your sense of autonomy because there's things that investor wants as a condition of their investment. And so you have to ask yourself, what's worth more than money? What are you willing to lose money over? What are you willing to not get that economic benefit in regard to upholding? So that's a really important question for any individual or who's a part of a cooperative or a cooperative in general. What's worth more than money? And so when it comes to investors, Non-user investors, meaning, for example, a grocery store who might be trying to raise money, they've got members that they might raise money from, right? They might get that member loan, or they might ask them to support some type of capital campaign in a different way of donation. Or, you know, maybe they decide to use a portion of the folks' initial investment to get a part of it. But then a non-user investor, they have a different perspective in regard to that grocery store. They're not necessarily in there for the benefit or the opportunity to be a part of the co-op. They're maybe trying to get a return. And so they might try to get voting rights. Should they get it if they're non-member, right? That's something you have to think about. If they're not going to get the benefits of participating and thinking about the co-op in a sustainable way, should they get voting rights? They might ask for a right to appoint nominees to the board. How do we deal with that? These are things that are coming up. Or for a bank, you know, if it's a lender, you might think, is there a prepayment clause that we can have, right? Suppose we generate enough surplus to pay off the loan. Are they going to penalize us for that? Or is there a covenant that says they've got to get paid back before anyone else, right? Maybe it was seller finance, and now the seller is, you know, all tied up and in our expenses, and they're not going to get paid back. The lender's going to get paid back. So you want to think about these things. So let's think about cooperatives considering the priority of these variety of sources. The first should be the cooperative's own members, right? You can think of that member share, you can think of member loans, you can think of member donations targeted towards a specific thing. And then second, other cooperatives and cooperative financial institutions, because they get you. They're not going to be trying to hold you accountable or be extractive by, you know, putting liens on all the assets in the same way that another institution might. So, you know, that's kind of your second go-to. Third, bonds and social investors, folks who really care about the social component as well as the economic component, because you're not just a business when you're a cooperative. And fourth, commercial lenders, right? The typical financial markets that folks can access that are non-co-op specific. So we would encourage folks to think of these relative priorities in regard to the priority wearing each of these sources.
Johan, 2-minute warning.
Gotcha. And so the balance needs to be kept between internal member financing and external member finances, and members need to really watch that. And so let's think about strategic partners, purchasers and suppliers. Your autonomy can be compromised by becoming over-dependent on a supplier. And so what might you do if a major buyer seeks to inflict substantial price reductions, right? They're your biggest contract, they love your product, and now they're saying, you know what, instead of $10 a bushel or whatever it is, we want $5. Now, what do? That messes up your whole value chain. How do you deal with that? And how might you not have this problem? I think cooperatives have an advantage here because you go into a grocery store co-op, for example, and you see many different brands that you're not going to see. And that's because there's many different people involved in making that decision. There's many different people who they have connections with. And so typically co-ops are more sustainable in this way because they have more diverse relationships and therefore more resilient food supply or value chain. And so, you know, co-ops have to lean into this, to recognizing that as powerful as it is to have so many members and perspectives on our team, that's how we have to think about when it comes to our vendors and suppliers. You know, it's not really the case that we want to find that big meaty contract and stick it out as long as we can, do whatever it is to serve them. And so, you know, when it comes to independence, the most dangerous thing is kind of found within the halls and the doors of the co-op. And, you know, that's related to poor governance or bad management. And the danger with looking out of the organization for the solutions, right? And so the corporate solution might be in regard to appointing non-member executives or independent non-member executives to bring other skills that we don't have. Now, that's not a bad idea, but it treats the organization as something that just relies on expertise, right? And what happens when you outsource that expertise in regard to your influence and your responsibility, right? The answer is nothing. Nothing happens. You get less capable over time if you continue to outsource the needs of your co-op. And so the question is then, how does member control become reconciled with the elected leaders having the knowledge they need to run the cooperative. And so we talk about the intelligence within the cooperative solution, which ensures that through education, training, and development, board members, staff, everyone involved has a skill to fulfill their role. And so this is a people-driven perspective. It's not expertise. It's not we need these skills. It's that what skills do our people have? And so that comes with self-assessment. That comes with board assessment. That comes with planning for leadership succession. How are people in the pipeline for leadership roles? And ultimately, that's grounded in education, training, and sharing information. And so this is a quick chart that I referenced in the last session. You can see on the vertical line, the skill level to use a particular item or a particular service or an organization. And on the horizontal line, your ability. And you can see on the left line that when you outsource, your skill level reduces. And when you educate for a difficult task, your skill level increases. So, it's a very simple concept, but it's important to think about. And so, the intelligence within, this is a quote I wanted to reference. The future of every community lies in capturing the passion, imagination, and resources of its people. And that's something I think cooperatives are uniquely positioned to achieve. And I think it's really important. And I'll close out with these last two slides, moving beyond P4 of autonomy and independence, because it's really important when you're dependent on the government or people with power to get into a space of independence. But that's not the end of the story. We're trying to recognize our interdependence with everyone involved. That includes the members or the workers, the board, and the manager. How are these three forces linked, right? The members or the workers grant power to the board, which then hires a manager, and so on. These three forces need to be kept in check and in relationship with each other. And this is sourced from Dowie's Democratic Management Guide, something that you can really check out to get a deeper grasp of this. And then it talks about these intangibles beyond the people, who then allow through processes a sense of power, right? What decisions we can make, who then share information, and then we then derive our economic benefits or money from that process. And so the interdependence of these four things are also really important to emphasize and highlight. And so I'll close on this. The danger with the closed group, the more people, members, general public, politicians know about the benefits of cooperatives and cooperation, that the better protected our autonomy and independence will be. And so that's really important to recognize, that we can't just keep this to ourselves. We have to keep on sharing and evangelizing in terms of, letting people know how powerful this can be. So that's my piece. If we have any questions, we can engage them. Otherwise, we can move into activities.
Yeah, and I had said in the chat, I know that I think Real Pickles had some particular kind of reflections as a result of their experience during the pandemic about kind of supply chains and relationships and that bit. So I'd love it if they'd just take a second to just jump in on that.
Sure.
To put you on the spot a little bit.
No problem. I'll take production side and Lucy can talk sales a little bit. So on the production side of things, in terms of the pandemic, we were in a really solid position where most of our farmers, we have a really diverse group of farmers who were supplying us. So we were able to just lean on that in a really amazing way. We have had some problems recently on the production side with glass and being able to get that. Our main glass producer got hacked. That was awesome. And the kind of amazing thing is, because we use square jars, we actually got a disruption in our glass later than most of the other people who use glass jars, who use the round ones, because they had more, there are more of them. So they had more limits earlier on in the pandemic than we did. So our quirky square jars saved us from early pandemic shortages in that way. All right, Lucy, what you got?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a question that's like still on our minds, like this kind of, maintaining autonomy and like business resilience. These are kind of decisions that, you make big decisions that set you up, but you're also maintaining this over time. And the pandemic had a really differential impact on different sort of like different channels that we sell to. You know, we had big declines in food service, and we also had a lot of increase in grocery. So, you know, from our perspective, it was a it was a moment of crisis that sort of like reinforced the importance of having those multiple channels and outlets. And because, you know, it was a really hard time for some of our restaurant partners, and for a lot of restaurants broadly, and food service workers and the whole economy. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm just really resonating with what's been shared so far, and these kind of big conceptual tools are helping me see our work in a different way. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and Annie also shared that they use a bunch of small distributors instead of just one big one. And that, you know, again, like, I mean, I think the rule of thumb I've always heard is like, if more than 20% of either your supply or your demand is wrapped up in one institution, that's potentially risky, and probably varies from industry to industry, but just knowing what that benchmark is for your co-op can be really helpful to maintaining that independence. Other questions?
Do you have some more in the chat, or positive comments? Yeah, definitely. I think you know, that point you guys made is really important, because your typical for-profit business, you're looking for that big fish, and that's not going to be the most sustainable way a lot of the time, you know. So I think that's a really key distinction, and really important to retaining autonomy. Okay. Are we ready to get into some activities?
Go for it.
Okay. So our activity is going to offer 2 examples, and we're going to put you into 2 different groups to explore these 2 examples. We're going to share the link in the chat now, so you have it in advance to this presentation. And below, you're going to see the 2 examples. The first is going to be group 1. This is the scenario, and then you'll be filling in the answers to that question in the slide right beneath it. And then you've got group 2. This is your scenario, and you'll be filling in the answers and generally discussing it in the slide below it. So 2 groups. You've got the link in the chat. Does anyone have any questions before we assign the breakout groups? Okay, so we're gonna break you out. We'll have about 10 minutes to engage this, and then we'll come back and we'll report on those results. When you get into your group, choose someone to write, and when you come back out to report, have identified someone who'll speak. Obviously, the whole group can share whatever, but be prepared to have someone who is identified as a speaker, and have someone identified as the scribe. Anything to add, Carolyn?
Nope.
Okay.
Ready to go?
I have a quick question. It looks like I am only view only on this. So
Excellent.
just on the typing part.
Let's allow some edits. So
Are you able to do that, Johan?
yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Cool.
And you guys will have that option by the time you get into the groups.
Awesome.
Can you set up the groups, Carolyn?
They are ready. Just tell me when to hit go, and people will shoot off into the ether.
Gotcha. All right.
Breakout group.
With 10 action-packed minutes.
It was solid. We had a good time.
No kidding.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. Welcome back. We didn't identify a speaker, but Annie, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. So we were talking about developing a very cheap food co-op for only $1 million. And we've got 500 interested members so far. And this co-op is going to be in a low income, diverse urban neighborhood. And we're trying to think about how are we going to finance our build out, from who, and on what terms. And on the next slide, Can you make it bigger?
Yes.
Thanks.
Oops.
We were talking about the sources of capital you see there, like obviously ownership shares and member loans, the possibility of preferred shares running a direct public offering, grant money, so many different kinds of tax credits. If there's a current building, a landlord allowance for the build out. Crowdfunding is always fun. That's why it has fun in it. Bank debt or other kinds of debt, and state or city money. And then in terms of terms, it took us a little while to make that very long list, so we didn't get very deep into the terms, but we were just talking about the specifics around, the first two are about member ownership shares and member loans. So the pros and cons and what sorts of stuff goes into it. So ownership shares, you could set up payment plans and sliding scale. You want to set it not too high and not too low. And it doesn't give us very much financial capital, but it's essential for getting grant money and also gives us a lot of social capital. And member loans, they're often cheaper than bank debt. We get to set the terms. It can be delayed repayment. It often waits until the store is profitable before repayments happening. And we get to have members capitalize and create wealth for themselves, basically, is the co-op is helping to create that wealth, which is super. And for both member loans and preferred shares, it's socially responsible investing. And similarly for preferred shares, we get to set the terms. The end.
Absolutely. Anything else you might want to add, Maggie, or anything? I think that was great.
No, the only thing I said was that every loan is subordinate to the more formal lender debt, bank, CDFI, credit union. But if you're working with a cooperative lender, the terms of that loan can often be somewhat negotiated within certain parameters. So.
Yep. So that was us. Now let's do green group 2. Is it an identified speaker?
No, Joshua or Lucy, do one of you want to go, since we've heard from you a lot? And there are lots of notes on the next slide, if you want to set it up.
Sure, I'm willing. Joshua, I think you were passing it to me right at the end of our group. So let's see here. I unfortunately am not going to be able to read the notes super well because I'm on this call on my phone. So I'm going to do some of this from memory. I'd say that we kind of mapped out several potential strategic moves, but we didn't come to a decision. Our scenario was we are an immigrant-led landscaping co-op. We've got 3 worker owners and 5 seasonal workers. We made $30,000 in surplus income this year. What are we going to do with it? And I guess we kind of talked about like 3 main different ways we might reinvest or 3 different ways, things we might decide to do with that income. One was like provide some support to the seasonal workers. And that could be like some kind of end of season bonus or something that would sort of incentivize them returning next year and continuing to have a stake in potentially becoming owners in the co-op or staying connected to the co-op. We also talked about the potential of like buying equipment or reinvesting in the business in a way that would enable the business to grow and accommodate more full-time employees or like lengthen the season of our work. We briefly debated how much snowblowers cost. And then we also talked about, giving some of that income to worker owners to keep people engaged in the co-op and to find that balance of like not having worker ownership be something that people burn out doing. So that was sort of what we mapped out, but we didn't sort of get down to divvying up that $30,000 into those pots and kind of prioritizing it. And we talked a little bit about decision making and mainly just identified that like getting input from the seasonal folks on the team is a really important part of the process, because anything that the co-op does that tries to meet, or I think Caroline said, those seasonal workers are part of the co-op too. The co-op is meeting their needs too. And so it helps to find out what those needs are. You don't want to like, lengthen the season if people actually want something else from the co-op. That's about as far as we got.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Is there anything else to add here?
I'll just share too that, one of the things I found really interesting in the conversation was a couple of folks really identified that where the co-op is in its life stages and its sort of phase of life would determine what type of investment it would make. So definitely thinking like, oh, it's very small, it's probably still growing. There's this whole pool of seasonal workers who might be member track, and if it's versus if it were a mature co-op and it was like, yeah, we're cool with having 3 members and having 5 part-time people who work for us, you might make a different decision about where the money gets invested versus we have these 5 folks. We'd love for them to be able to be full members. What would it take for them to feel like the co-op was something that they could invest in? Being able to provide year-round work would probably be part of that. But it was neat to see how sort of where the co-op was in its life cycle impacted people's thinking about, well, what does the structure mean? What's the best use of the investment, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think it kind of subtly touches that idea of, who are we dependent on and how do we ensure kind of our stability by taking those different or that main focus into consideration, that main resource that we're dependent on. So I think that's really important. Okay, so that leads us to the end of our session for today. Unless there's any further questions, we want to make sure we refer you to a few guides that can definitely help you dive deeper into this practice. One that I mentioned a lot was the Democratic Membership Management Guide from Dowie. That just came out this year. We have the guidance notes to the Cooperative Principles from the International Cooperative Alliance, and 21 ways to celebrate the true spirit of cooperative economics with concrete collective action. So lots of really good resources out there, and we encourage you to dive in and share the word. Make sure you're geeking out with your friends about this stuff. Any questions, or Carolyn?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, speaking of geeking out, I know that I put the kibosh down on a couple of times when people were starting to ask kind of a more in-depth specific question. So since we do have a little bit of time, if people would like to ask those questions now, also, we have Maggie, who's a loan officer, on the call. So if you have like nitty-gritty questions about co-ops, we see a lot of them. So happy to be a resource.
My main member share question is actually about if you all know of any co-ops who have changed their member share amount and how they have done that successfully. Yes, a yard and a half did. Okay. We're by far not the only one. Yeah. But yeah. My experience is just one experience. I know that South Mountain has definitely increased theirs over the years also. Oh, no, I'm talking about the other direction. Oh, the other direction? No, yeah. So South Mountain went up, yard and a half went down. Great. So yard and a half, our member share was originally set because we had a certain amount of equity that we needed in order to get a loan. Both the retiring owner and CFNE wanted to see a certain amount of equity. And so we had a higher member buy-in than was really doable or attractive for the population of folks that we had as future members. And so once we sort of had a few years under our belt and that individual member buy-in wasn't as critical for the co-op's finances, we cut it in half. And so what that meant was we went back and readjusted for folks who already had a buy-in as part of their capital account. We just cashed them out half of it so that everybody then had an equal amount as their buy-in. Yeah. Do you mind telling me what the original and the secondary one were? It went from 7,000 to 3,500. Okay. And we're currently at 6, and we've had a few conversations over the years because similarly, it's not attractive. And we do a 4-year 0% loan for folks to pay in, and we have decent patronage. So like it's possible, but it's definitely the sticker shock for folks.
Right. Yeah, and we had about I can't remember the exact amount, it's been a while, but we had a pay in per pay period, and probably if we had had more of a financing plan, it might have been easier for people to handle. But yeah, it definitely is about sort of having a conversation with this is where prospective members are part of your decision-making body. They're a big part of your demographic and your stakeholders. So just having a conversation about both what would feel doable in terms of amount, in terms of terms and timing and whatnot, and also what do they see in it for them? Because that's the other side is, if you have good surplus, great. Not every co-op's in that position. Right. So if not, what are the other things that make membership attractive? Are there things about the decision making or opportunities for professional advancement or any of that kind of stuff?
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was great. Especially just referencing that point of, how that member buy-in could be leveraged with a lender and things like that for if you're interested in financing, that's really, really important to consider. Any other questions? Okay. So next steps for anyone who's interested is to book an appointment. We're happy to have these conversations long form. And, here's our contact information. Karen, you were going to say something?
Yeah. So the other thing is, apologies that we make you fill out this annoying sort of intake when you sign up for this. But part of the reason we do that is because it lets us make these free because they're grant supported. And also to be able to serve co-ops better, because actually we get a lot of really wonderful questions from people, and we're able to kind of tweak around the format and the content to respond to the questions that you all have. So thank you for wading through that every time. And just to name that, one of the questions that came up was about the cost of these, and they're free. Technical assistance from us is free. So anybody who's in a co-op or working on a co-op in New England, you don't have to be a borrower. We're happy to have a conversation with you. That's what we're here for, is to move this movement forward. So just to be explicit about that.
Absolutely. So I just want to say thank you for everyone to, for being here, for offering your time. We appreciate it. And we're here to offer our time as well. I'm going to stop sharing. And